I am already looking forward to the hate mail I'm about to get because of this segment. I like talking about religion. I think talking about religion is one of those things that adds a lot of depth and perspective to this show. And our next guest has been on the show twice before. And each time it stirred up a little bit of a controversy, which I absolutely love. So even if I invited this guy on to talk about recipes for French toast, it would stir some people the wrong way. And I totally dig that. That is so good. I love irritating people. But the topic today is one that if we went out onto the street and we asked people, hey, you know that Jesus guy, right? How long was his ministry? You would get the answer, well, it was 3 years, it was 3.5 years, and you would get it from atheists, you'd get it from Buddhists, you'd get it from that weird guy with the funky hair from Ancient Aliens. Everybody knows that he was conducting his ministry for about 3.5 years, right? Because that's just the way history records it. What if it wasn't recorded that way? And to discuss that seismic shift in thought, we have with us Michael Rood. Welcome to the show, my friend. How you been?
Well, thank you, Josh. I've been doing well. Just got back from Israel just in time for the Feast of Tabernacles, and then to get myself back here to be with you on the radio program discussing French toast. I can't wait to give you my most recent recipe.
You are too funny. So you have released something that is really kind of setting the faithful world on its ear. It's called the Chronological Gospels. Tell us, what is this, and how does it change how people think about the ministry and life of the man that we know as Jesus Christ?
Well, Josh, this has been the result of now over 40 years of work, and I set out after a lifetime. My first really 17 years of life was spent 5 times a week in church services, and I ended up at 17 asking questions because I was tired of not getting answers that were satisfying. I grew to the point now of actually hating religion. I don't like religion. I know we love talking about it, but I hate religion. I'm looking for the truth. I'm looking for real life. And when I was a young man, this got me on this track of solving the apparent contradictions that we read in the English versions of the Bible. And so when I published this book, it's called The Chronological Gospels, The Life and 70-Week Ministry of the Messiah. And this is after over 38 years working on the restoration of the ancient biblical calendar so that we could accurately decipher one of the most repeated prophecies in all of the Bible. Yeshua, said that there'd be just one sign of his authenticity. One sign, that's all we get. And if he can't get this right, then, there's nothing that we can trust. He said that he would be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights and raised on the third day. And yet all of us grew up in the Western world knowing that the crucifixion was on Good Friday when Dagon, the Syrian fish god, is worshipped. Well, I grew up eating fish on Friday in public schools in Michigan, and that he was raised from the dead on Easter Sunday when Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, was reincarnated as Easter, the bare-breasted Babylonian sex goddess who turned a bird into an egg-laying rabbit. These are the things, the traditions that we inherited, and there's nobody. Einstein himself could not get 3 days and 3 nights between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And yet, to me, this was important. Some people will say, I hear pastors say to me all the time, well, what difference does it make? And I have to agree with them. In their world, in the world of religion, truth doesn't matter. You don't have to count to 3. Nothing really matters because it's basically, as we say in Arabic, hockey foddy. It's made up BS. Instead of getting to the truth and having the truth matter in life, instead we just throw up whatever it is that keeps our denomination going. We see what sticks to the wall. We keep people from asking intelligent questions, and so we've dumbed down the entire establishment from, where at one time from Harvard University was said that no one can consider themselves to be an educated person unless they have a command of the scriptures. And now, we've been fighting biblical illiteracy for the last 40 years, and it's reached epidemic proportion. People are complete idiots in America. They don't read, they don't understand, they just pull things out of their hat, one verse sound bites, one sentence sound bites, and it doesn't fit. Well, I was tired of that when I was 17. I had enough religion when I was 17, and that's what put me on this track. And now we're exposing the fairy tale invented in the 4th century by Eusebius of the 3.5-year ministry, a complete fairy tale that the entire Western world has grown up in, just swallowing it, hook, line, and sinker.
And you wonder why the Baptists send me letters. You mentioned the apparent contradictions, and I love that you said apparent contradictions, because then you referenced, and we can start with this. You referenced what we know as Easter and this 3 days, 3 nights. This has gotten to pretty much everybody I've ever talked to who goes to any form of quote-unquote Christian denomination. And everybody who's 6 years old eventually comes up to the pastor and says, Pastor, I don't get 3 days and 3 nights out of Friday, Saturday. I mean, how did this? You would be the world's worst travel agent if I booked a cruise through you, because I would leave on Friday and get back on Saturday. So let's just take that. When did he actually go into the ground, and when did he come up?
Well, one of the things that we had to solve the problem was getting back to the biblical calendar that was used in the time of the Second Temple period. And that's a biblical calendar, but on the other hand, 42 years before Jesus was born, the Julian calendar was put in place, and the Julian calendar still remains today the time clock of astrophysics. And we can go back and take that calendar back to any point in time to 45 BCE, to January 1st when it was instituted, and we can know exactly what day of the week it was on, no problem. But it took over 38 years of work to reestablish the ancient biblical calendar, which is based on the phases of the moon. Literally, the first sliver of the sighting of the new moon was what we began the month. And there is no question about this historically. The writings of the rabbis, the Pharisees go back 300 years before the New Testament was written, and we know exactly what was done in the Second Temple period. But until NASA put mirrors on the moon, shine laser beams off them for a 10-year period, running the calculations through the Cray supercomputer, we did not have what we needed to be able to establish the visible sighting criteria of the new moon to take us back to that time. So now we can go back with all the Roman records, the biblical records, and know with absolute accuracy, dead on to the day of exactly when the crucifixion took place, the day the resurrection took place, when Yeshua was born. It is all there. There's no question about this at all, except among the ignorant who have not studied this. But, we're all ignorant in one area or another. I'm not putting down ignorance.
Well, sure.
I mean, you can name a field, and I would be ignorant in it. I'm sure it's not that difficult. But, one area that I do know, and that is the biblical calendar and how we got taken off track into a complete fairy tale, the 3.5 years, which destroys any possibility.
Well, Michael, hold on one second. We're up against the break. We'll get to the 3.5 years. We'll also get the rest of the 3-day answer, because I want to know, when did he go up and when did he go down and when he came up. We'll be right back, folks. Don't go anywhere. So then you take the French toast and just a little bit of powdered sugar. Oh, we're back? All right, so we're talking to Michael Rood, and we're talking about the chronological Gospels. The idea that, hey, wait a second, it wasn't 3.5 years. What are you talking about? I mean, wasn't there a prophecy about a heifer or something? I mean, don't we know that it was 3.5 year ministry of Jesus? And it turns out not to be the case. Michael, we left off the last segment, and we were getting to Easter, just to talk about how we don't understand what it is we're actually reading. When was he actually buried? Was he buried on a Friday? Was he buried on a Wednesday? When did he actually go into the ground?
No. What we have is the entire prophetic picture of the Lamb of God, the Passover lamb as the sacrifice, the substitutionary sacrifice. The year that Yeshua was crucified, the Passover sacrifice was done on a Wednesday. That was the 14th day of the month of the Aviv. He was sacrificed, crucified at the very hours that the Passover lambs were being sacrificed on the Temple Mount, which, according to Josephus, around that period was was around 250,000 lambs were being sacrificed that afternoon. He was on the cross at that very hour. He was in the grave before sunset, and at sunset begins the high Sabbath, not the weekly Sabbath, the high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He's in the grave all Thursday night, all Friday night, and all Wednesday, all Thursday night, and all Friday night. He is in the grave 3 days. He's in all day Thursday, all day Friday, all day Saturday. He's raised on the Sabbath day. When the women came early the first day of the week, it was still dark. The grave was empty. He wasn't raised on the fourth night. That is nonsense. He wasn't raised on a Sunday. He was raised on the Sabbath day. The scriptures are very clear about this. And when they came to the grave before sunrise, it was already empty at that time. The year was 28 of the Common Era. There is no 3.5-year ministry. As a matter of fact, it was, Josh, that for the over 300 years after the event, every disciple of the apostles, every disciple of the disciple of the disciples of the apostles, for 300 years, not one of them gave one dissenting opinion. They all said that his ministry was about 1 year. It was Eusebius, the champion of Constantine the heretic, the one that brought in all the pagan sun god worship and made Rome a Christian empire with the stroke of a pen without one convert. It was Eusebius, the bishop, the overseer at Caesarea, about an hour from the house in Israel. He was the bishop there, and he came up with, and this is his statement, Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years, which is 1/2 of a week. That immediately tells you that he is one of a million people who've attempted to understand the prophecy of Daniel, which now occurs in the 9th chapter after chapters were added. But that messianic prophecy, he's trying to decipher it, and so he came up with this ridiculous nonsense of a 3.5-year ministry, and that is the beginning of putting Constantine in the place of naming himself the Pontifex Maximus, the Almighty God upon the earth, the vicar of Christ, and that the Messiah isn't really going to return. All prophecy has been fulfilled, and Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years. Absolute lunacy, absolute heresy, and yet that's what we inherited through Rome. But I'll tell you, the reformers had some big fish to fry. They were burning them at the stake. They were strangling them. They were hunting them down, and nobody stopped to question this. This is added to what Luther's thesis should have been nailed to the door of the church at Wittenberg. There are things that got to get cleaned up because religion has completely dumbed down this entire religious establishment.
Oh, and the fallout from that, has just been incredible because people who are borderline believers, that they might be agnostic or something, they don't believe that we came from a bunch of goo that somehow spontaneously became a human. But they don't believe in the Bible because of these apparent contradictions and traditions that have been kept up by humans, And one of them is Easter. One of them is the life of Jesus. And in the faithful communities, we just blindly accept this stuff without bothering to read the text and see what it says. So how does this line up with the heifer prophecy? Because every time we talk about, it's not 3.5 years, and this heifer story comes up. What's the heifer story, and how does it apply to this?
Here's something completely fabricated by Gentiles. They said the red heifer was 3.5 years old, and that Jesus is the red cow, the red female cow, not the Lamb of God, but behold the cow of God. First of all, the 3.5-year or 3-year-old red heifer is a complete made-up. It is a lie that was conjured up in the minds of these sick, twisted people who want to make this 3.5-year ministry real. There is no such thing in the history of Israel. You can check the Talmud, the Mishnah, all of the details. Not one mention of a 3-year-old heifer. It's completely made up. The red heifer could have been a year old. It could have been 15 years old. There is absolutely not even the rabbis don't even mention the number 3. They'll talk about 1. They'll talk about 5. They'll talk about over 5. It never, ever comes up in the history of the Hebrew language by any of the rabbis or anyone. It's just made up by Gentiles, and this is the problem. You have Gentiles who try to interpret scriptures Jews have written. I say, let the Jews interpret the scriptures the Jews have written, and we'll leave plenty of time for the Gentiles to interpret all the scriptures they've written. But even in English language, they don't accurately translate things, and they have to be corrected. That's why the basis of the chronological Gospels, which has more than 300 individual incidents in Yeshua's life and ministry in exact chronological order, it's based on the King James Version. It's called the corrected King James Version because, of course, we all know that nobody is reading the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. It was revised in the 1700s, again in the 1800s, again in the 1900s. Then the new King James came out, and it updates the language. We use verbs differently. Words have a completely different meaning, 180 degrees, some of them, from when they were used in 1611. And so it needed to be updated and corrected according to the ancient text. And I can give a wonderful example of that because I have great respect for William Tyndale. I mean, he's my hero. And the King James, basically, 80% of the King James New Testament is right straight from William Tyndale. I mean, the man died for doing the right thing. But yet, there are some things that he didn't handle accurately because he did not have things in chronological order. Chronology is the ultimate context. Time is the ultimate context. If you don't have time, you don't have cause and effect. You simply have numbered sound bites that are completely disjointed from reality, that are thrown out on a Sunday morning sermon, spiritualized to complete nonsense, and so nobody knows the gospel of the kingdom that Yeshua was teaching, the gospel of the kingdom that resulted in his execution.
And Michael, the chronological aspect of this is really massive. I mean, if this was a court case for a murder or a bank robbery, that's the first question: when, where? I mean, it's all about time. You need a timeline, and to enter into a faith without acknowledging that timeline is there, and then, as you pointed out, we haven't even really been able to see that timeline until NASA started shooting lasers off the moon. That really lets you get to this point scientifically where you say now is the time where we can actually look back and put this all in order, right?
Yes, and this is the first time it's ever been done. Many have tried, but it's all been based on this fairy tale by Eusebius. And then what is so hard for people to grab onto is that we have the text of the Gospel of John that goes back before the 4th century when they started adding in a line that was put there to artificially lengthen Yeshua's ministry by an entire year. John chapter 6, verse 4, at the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only miracle recorded by all 4 gospel authors, every one of the gospel authors puts it at the end of the summer just before the Feast of Tabernacles.
Hold on one second, Michael. We're up against the break. I hear the music in my ear. We'll get to the feeding of the 5,000 right after we get to these commercial breaks. Don't go anywhere, folks. If you are a believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then this is a conversation that is just amazing you to no end. And if you're one of those atheists who love listening to the show, then you're just enjoying a wonderful conversation. But either way, you're going to want to get your hands on what's called the chronological Gospels. I mean, this is something that is by far absolutely amazing. If you are a KJV, a King James Version believer, and you're like, oh my gosh, I love the KJV, then you will love the chronological Gospels, because what science has allowed us to do, what calendars and 40 years of research has allowed us to finally witness, is the Bible put in order. Everybody and their brother acknowledges that it's not in order. And the order of things, just like in the case of a murder or the case of a marriage, the order in which you do things is extremely important to the overall message itself. So we're talking to Michael Rood about his masterpiece work here, the chronological Gospels. And Michael, you talk about these apparent contradictions, and even if you're reading King James Version Bibles today, you do get to some things like, well, when Jesus said, "It is said," and Jesus said, "It is written," people assume that he's talking about the same thing, but in reality, when he says, you've heard it said, he's actually talking about the oral Talmud back then. It wasn't written down yet. And when he said it is written, he's referring to the Torah and the prophets. But when we don't look at the Bible in context, we have no way of discerning the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus is talking about these things as separate entities, right? I mean, and that's why the context and chronological order of things is so important, isn't it?
That's right. And you bring up that great point. You've heard it said of them of all time, this. And who's the them? People don't even take a look at the them. It's the scribes and Pharisees who will not see the kingdom of heaven. This is the context. And so, people have to understand that the Bible is not just, numbered sound bites that you stick together at your convenience. It's the gospel of the kingdom that the disciples were teaching and doing miracles and raising the dead, and this was more than a half year before they knew anything or believed anything about the death, burial, and resurrection. The death, burial, and resurrection is not the gospel of the kingdom that Yeshua was preaching. But this is all that we hear in our churches today is some come to Jesus at the last stanza, just as I am, with every head bowed and every eye closed, with no one looking around. And this is all made up by Billy Sunday. That whole that whole procedure was not even part of anything that was going on when Yeshua and his disciples were preaching it. So to get back to that gospel, that's what sets a person's heart on fire and life on fire, to realize we are delivered from religion, from man-made religion. And once that happens, I'll tell you, life gets exciting. You start breaking all the rules, you get out of the box, and you start being successful in life instead of held down by the edicts of men. And that's where
let's get back to that, because I could talk to you all day about this stuff, but let's get back to the feeding of the 5,000 and how there's an apparent discrepancy there.
There we go. The feeding of the 5,000 is the one miracle that's covered by all four gospel authors. All of them, it happens at the end of the summer when the disciples come back from their paired assignments, 6 teams of 2, go out, and they're out there teaching and preaching. Then they come back, find out that John the Baptist has been executed, and that's when Yeshua feeds the 5,000. The very next chapter in John, he is going up to the Feast of Tabernacles. The same chapter in Luke, he's going up to the Feast of Tabernacles. But yet in John chapter 6, verse 4, we read, "And Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh." Hold on just a minute. Passover is an entire 6 months away, and it has nothing to do with what's going on right now. In fact, Yeshua is feeding 5,000 plus people with leavened barley loaves, which are not to be in any of the land of Israel. Everyone's supposed to be up to Jerusalem, but nobody's there, and Yeshua never goes up to it. And then let's say that it is Passover, and he's violating all these things, and nobody is at Jerusalem for it, which is absolutely asinine to even let that enter into our brain cells. But then it's an entire half year later that it's the next chapter. It's the same chapter in Luke. Those words, "and Passover feast of the Jews was nigh," is not in any text of the Bible until after the 4th century. And it ends up in our King James Version of the Bible because it is in the later Greek text, and it was added to artificially lengthen Yeshua's ministry by a whole year to try to get it to coincide with what Rome has been feeding and shoving down our throat. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to wake up and understand when religion starts adding things in and starts manipulating us, we are under their control. We will not be controlled. The truth is what sets us free.
Well, and that's so true, because so many people, like we referenced in the last segment, look at the Bible and say, well, look at this indiscrepancy, look at this indiscrepancy, so therefore I can't believe any of it. And in reality, when you get back to the Greek, when you get back to the Aramaic, when you get back to the Hebrew, you actually start realizing, wait a second, there's no indiscrepancies here. There's just misunderstanding of what is plainly written but misunderstood.
That's right, and we've got a beautiful example from the King James Version in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. It reads, "And it came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem." It is Wycliffe, who basically said the same thing. Murdoch, in his translation, says when the days for his ascension were completed. NAS says it came about the days were approaching for his ascension. NIV said the time approached for him to be taken up into heaven. And in every English version basically says the same thing. Wait just a minute. This is Luke chapter 9, verse 51. The ascension isn't until Luke chapter 24, verse 51. 15 chapters later, Yeshua is literally going to be going up to Jerusalem from that moment 5 more times before the ascension. But yet they all tell us that the time for his ascension has come. That is absolutely crazy. But yet that's what the English version says. But it's because we do not have the context of the culture and of the language. We read about this very incident where this is incident 125 in the chronological Gospels. This is happens on week 33. This is right after. This is John chapter 7. John chapter 6 is the feeding of the 5,000. Now it's John chapter 7, and it says, now the Feast of Tabernacles was drawing near. And so Yeshua's brother said, you go on up to the feast. And then he says in verse 5, he said, it's not my time, but you can go up anytime you're ready. The world hates me because I testify against it. But the world can't hate you, so go ahead up to the feast. I'm not going up to the feast. It is yet not time for me to go up. The word go up, even though we have the Bible and New Testament mostly in Greek, it's still describing a Hebrew culture. And what it's describing is the Hebrew word aliyah, which means to go up to the feast. That's the terminology we still use. I still live in Israel. We go up to the feast because it's on a higher altitude. And so when it talks about this in Luke 9:51, it's the very same incident. It's incident 126. It's the 12th day of the 7th month. It's Thursday, October 2nd, 27 of the Common Era. And in John it says his brothers went up to the feast. He also went up in secret. And in Luke 9:51, in the corrected version, now when the time came for him to go up to the feast, what feast? To Sukkot. It's time for him to go up or make aliyah to go up to the Feast of Tabernacles. But yet, every English translation has him going up to his ascension, which is absolutely dead wrong. He doesn't ascend for 15 more chapters. Most of the Gospel of Luke is yet to be spoken at this point. But see, this
and like
is
you
what
said,
happens.
he actually goes back to Jerusalem many times.
5 times. He's going to go up 5 times before his ascension.
Okay,
So
Michael, we're coming to the end of the show. People are obviously sitting there scratching their heads thinking, holy cow. I mean, to understand the Bible and then to do so in a chronological order would radically reinforce my faith. How do they get this chronological gospel?
The chronological gospels, you can go to the chronologicalgospels.com. The chronologicalgospels.com. And also, you can go to the website, the Root Awakening website. That's www.arootawakening, spelled R-O-O-D, arootawakening.tv. And the chronological gospel is shipping now. This is the end of the first printing. It's unbelievable. This stuff, we had to have more flown in, thousands more flown in, overnighted to us just to cover us. But this is $69 for the chronological gospels. You can get the essentials package, which has a 6 or 5 DVD set to help get you acquainted with the chronological gospels and show you some absolute treasures that you have never before experienced in your life, along with the 3-foot-long
timeline poster.
Time period.
All right, Michael, we got to let you go. Make sure you get this. Go to rootawakening.tv. This will, I'm telling you, it'll radically change how you perceive the entire timeline. Today, tomorrow, as always, my friends, may your path lead to heaven, and may freedom follow in your footsteps.